Hello and welcome back. Today I'm starting with a quick sketch I did of North Sands Beach in Salcombe, and I decided I like the idea of the little hut and the cliffs and the rocks and wild surf towards the harbour entrance and the navigation markers. So I've picked a different pad and I'm going to concentrate on the middle bit. But my sketch is still very useful for getting all the details. So to start with, it's a blustery day. I've still got some of the colours left from the sketch. So I'm going to mix up a turquoise that's got a tiny bit of grey in it for the sky. I'm putting that on quite strong because the cliffs are brown in lots of places with the rock. And so it will knock the colour back. And I'm leaving room for gaps in the trees on the hillside. So while it's still wet, I'm just going to get some stronger paint and drop it in to the wet paint. And it'll find its own way. And then because it's sort of a blustery day, there's a change of colour in the sky. I'm just going to add water at the bottom. And then just lift the pad up and let it run upwards. Doesn't matter if it's gone on the hillside a little bit, you can take it back with your finger. So whilst that's drying, I can concentrate on a little bit of beach which has got standing water. So it's sort of like a dirty blue in the fact that there's sand showing through. So I'm putting a little bit of blue down. And I'm now adding some yellow ochre, and I've got a big brush. I'm just going to blend it into each other to give a lost edge. There's a little stream that goes down the middle, and I am doing that quite pale at the moment because I can come back to it. And this reflection to the hillside here, but this leads you into the picture, and the light bit of the sky will lead you further. It doesn't stop you. So the next stage is to get a small brush and put some of the beach in opposite because it's low tide. So again, yellow ochre but slightly diluted. I just find where there's a change in level of the rocks and just put the slightest hint of sand colour there. Again, that leads you into the hillside. I've only sketched the drawing very lightly because these things develop as you're going along. But I do want to I put the water in on the beach. I want to put the sand in on the beach. And I can see by my sketch that that starts where somebody is standing. So I'm just gently putting some sand in. And it goes in front of the rocks. There's a bit of a lost edge by the surf. I'm doing it with a number 3 brush because I need to be exact where the sand's going to give a good effect. There are rocks on the beach, but I can go over those just a little bit because they're going to be darker. And then along the beach there's lots of water that's just picking up the reflection of the cliffs, so there isn't so much sand. Let's put in a little bit, and then there's water reflections and then more sand, just sort of little rivulets of it. There's a lost edge where it joins the water that's coming down the stream. So while the sand's still wet, I'm just going to add a little bit of that. And it's quite dark in places, but I'll just cover the white paper for now. So you can now see that the picture's leading you into the water. Now, the water's quite important to put in quite soon because then I can make sure that it's a dominant tone to the hillsides. And it's a reflection of the sky. It's a bit stirred up from all that surf. So I'm adding Viridian to French ultramarine and the cobalt turquoise to make it slightly warmer but greyer blue. And there are waves breaking over things, so I'm going to start very gently right near the rocks, and there's a little wave just breaking in the middle. I'll just feather that out. And there's wave breaking on the beach, so I need to stop short of that. And there are darker lines where there's sort of semi-broken waves. So I'll just put one coat in and then go back for the darker waves. There's quite a distinctive surf line, which is good because it'll give a bit of punch, an area of white. And there's more rocks here, so there's more surf. So I'll leave a gap. White waves breaking on the other side, but they're not 100% line, they're a bit staggered. So just on the far side, I'm just going to lose a little bit, so it looks like they're every now and again, not constant. So that's set the scene up quite nicely for tonal values. The next thing is, I think, the hut, which on the day I was sketching looked grey. It might be faded wood, but it's a good start to put in homemade grey, and then I can have the cliffs a different colour, and it's got some light bouncing on it, so I'm just going to get the brush and just take a little bit of paint off one side, and it's a cool colour against the warm beach. As there's a lot of green coming down the cliffs, so before I lose the space, I'm just going to add some chrome yellow to the brown I've already got, which will darken it, and then work my way from the tree line down. Now, the grass isn't everywhere. It might not be grass, whatever's got the courage to cling to the rock, but it is green, and that helps the colour scheme and the composition. But it's certainly not everywhere. It stops short, so you have to map things off against the rocks where it stops. There's obviously a little bit of shelter there, and then taking it through just a little bit lightly, broken colour. Now I'm going to make up some homemade grey. I'll put the recipe in the description. And to start putting in the rocks where they meet the sand and working back up. I'm just going to put them in as one colour. There might be some blue on the brush which will show. That doesn't matter. And then I'll add the darker shadows and underside to the rocks in a moment. But what I'm doing is going up in the direction of the cliff, the way it's formed by winter storms and the hardness of the rock. And then from the top I need a darker colour coming down, so I'm going to add indigo to burnt sienna just to make a neutral brown, and come down the other way, the way the cliffs are formed, and then going right to the edge where it joins the fields. They will be darker, but I need to get the shape in first and just lose the edges. By doing one colour coming down and another one going up, does a lot of the work for you, and then lose it into the tree line. Try and lose all the edges you can. And it's quite dark underneath the hut, but I'll just put one colour in for the moment. Now the rocks on the beach, they might be wetter more often, or it might be a different rock, but they are very dark. So I'm making the same colour but stronger. And I'm going to go in with a size 1 brush and just get the shape of the rock. There's somebody standing on there, which is quite useful for scale. So I've got the shape of the rock, and I'm now going to get paint on the brush and just drop it in I'm not doing the bit on top because that's a white wave that's breaking. And then on the beach, it's a job to say whether they're flat rocks or whether it's seaweed. There's a few little things, so just get the brush and just lose the edges of them again and drop a little bit more paint into the rocks. And the rocks continue up to the cliff. So I'm just finding the top edge at the moment, not worried about the bottom edge. And again, just with the wet brush, loaded with paint, drop the same colour in and let it find its own route. Now I've got to pay attention to the bottom, more of a straight line here. And then it goes behind some rocks, so it needs a wavy bottom as well. And then it's more lost and found edges, so I'll just do the angle of the cliff. And the very dark rock goes all the way up to the tree line. And even though they're not wet, they're still dark because they're in shadow of the trees. I'm still going happily with the number 1 brush. I'm just going to get a tiny bit more indigo, drop it in. Don't want it to be too dominant, but it needs to have some strength to separate it from the other side of the harbour entrance. And then I need a lost edge, so I'm just putting on some weaker paint onto the brush and pulling the paint forward. Tiny bit of darker paint just to give a lost edge. They are rocks, you don't want a neat finish. And I've got one dark rock on the beach. It looks like it's just a bit's fallen off, and that's the underside of it. It's not too dark, it's quite a lot of brown. Let's just drop in some burnt sienna. And then it's very dark under the hut, but there's a central post. Well, central to the platform, not the hut. I need a straight edge there, so I'm just drying off the brush. And I'll go the other side of the post and the platform. And that goes off at a triangle. So that makes the hut stand out a bit more. And then there's nooks and crannies where the rock is sort of segmented. I'm just going to put in a dark line for 1 or 2 of those. Clean brush, just lose the edge. Let the water take the paint a little bit further. I'm going to let that dry now so I don't smudge it, and go to the other side. I'm just going to drop those in. All helps the white surf look stronger. There are some further up here, but I don't want to smudge anything that's wet, so I'll leave that for a moment. Before I put the far hillside on, I'm going to put a few more details on here so that I can get the tones quite well separated. In my quick sketch, there's holes in the tree so that you can see the sky and the other hillside beyond. So I'm going to mix up a warm green, out French ultramarine, some of the sky colour and sea colour that I've already got, so there's harmony, and add foliage just a little bit higher. Which will make the gap more apparent. A little bit more of the sky colour in the green. And then there's some trees that are very, very dark, so I've got indigo and viridian and chrome yellow all together, just to make up a darker green. And I'm doing short little movements so it's not solid. These trees are in an extreme position, so they are shaped by the wind, and they're not solid. There's lots of little holes in them. In fact, the branches are quite evident, and I'll leave a gap for those. And the foliage is more on the far side of the tree. I'm now working my way nearer the hut, showing the underside of the trees and shrubs in shadow and the sunlight hitting the top. And it all helps to give shape and form to the cliff. By making the near hillside quite bold, it'll make the other side of the estuary look more distant. I'm starting by finding the top of the hill, just gently putting in anything that's dominant to get the shape. In this case, it's a field at the top, and it doesn't matter if it's not one colour throughout, because it just adds more interest and variation. The next thing is to put in the coastal footpath that runs around the bottom, and that's a good separator for the rocks and the greenery. Next, I'm finding the area around the sea level and starting with a much weaker mix of the paint I used for the nearby beach. The same sort of rocks, but they're at a distance and there's a lot of light from the sea that's bouncing around, so it'll make them look lighter. And just putting in a rough line with a wobbly edge near the sea, then I can add detail of certain rocks later on. For the hillside, I'm using diagonal brush strokes, and I've added a little bit of blue to the green to make it look more distant. But every now and again, I'm putting in a warmer green just to show that there is something growing on the hillside. And then gently merging the colours together so it looks more natural. Towards the top of the hill, there are a few trees and bigger shrubs, so I'm going in with slightly stronger colour, slightly darker, to show that there is a difference there. And the same at the bottom where it meets the rock. I'm just doing diagonal strokes again, just to show that it joins the rocks, but there is an irregular join. This hillside is reflected in the foreground in the beach where there's lots of standing water. It's the exact shape, but it's brown. Sometimes reflections are different when they're at a great distance. I'm going to put a first coat on, and then when it's dry I'll put some highlights on, but I'm moving across the page to the nearer rocks that are also reflected on the beach, that are much darker because they're nearer. I'm starting by changing the angle of the pad because it's important that you're comfortable when you're painting and that the reflections are at the right angle. They're coming straight down from the cliff and the trees. And to start with, there's tree branches that are higher up the cliff that are reflected. And so some of the lines are vertical and some are horizontal. There's 2 or 3 shades of brown in the reflections and some green. So you've got to make sure that when you start that you're sure of all the things you've got to put in. I've started with the reflections that are coming straight down in a mid-brown with a bit of grey in it. And I'm now going to go with the horizontal reflections that are a much darker, richer brown. So I'm using burnt sienna for that I've just tinted slightly with a bit of blue. And I'm doing some from the left and some from the right to give a more random result. Whilst the paint's still wet, I'm adding very dark brown, which is mostly indigo, rather than half and half with burnt sienna, and just putting dappled marks vertically to show where there's dark areas of the cliff that are reflected. There are very strong reflections even where there's only very shallow water where it's lapping up onto the beach. and these still have a great intensity of colour. So when you're out painting, you have to look very closely. It doesn't necessarily matter whether the water's an inch deep or to infinity. You still, if it's sheltered, will get a very intense reflection. Together with long streaks of colour. Some of them will be very pale and others will be very dark. The shape of the nearest cliffs are quite well defined in the water, but they're slightly over to the left because that's the way that the sun's shining. Whilst that's drying, I'm doing exactly the same thing on the opposite side of the estuary, just putting in a few rocks, one by the navigation marker, and then there's a couple of little rocks there that are causing some surf, and the others are very distant, so you can't be too exact. Just make a few marks that don't stand out too much. Then I'm returning to the waterline on the far hillside and just giving the rocks that I've already put a base coat on a little bit more shape and form by putting a few darker highlights on. And returning to the near beach, the first lot of rocks I put in have dried, so I can again add more shape and form to them. Also, the reflection has dried, and I'm using quite absorbent paper, so I can now put a second coat on that to give it a little bit more power. I'm using the same colours as before, but just giving them a second coat of paint just to make it look warmer and more inviting. It's the sort of afternoon sun reflections. They always have a little bit of warmth. And this time I'm adding a little bit of green from the lower foliage around the hut that's reflected. I'm returning to the far hillside just to put a little bit more definition on now it's dry. There's lots of trees that are just hugging the hillside, and they tend to grow down in lines, slightly bluey mix in between them. I don't want it to look striped, but it just needs to show what is growing there. Ring the changes, have a different green, and then get a smaller brush, some slightly darker colour. Just put in a few indications of shadows, a little bit more indigo on it. Then wipe brush off clean water, just lose the edges, and then go back with the green again. Just lose it a little bit, and then coming around some more area with just grass, and the shrubs and bigger bushes are at the top. So I'll just make a wavy line at the top and bring them down. And the cliffs at the bottom, as it's low tide, got quite a few prominent areas that are standing out in shadow. So I'm getting the brownie mix, just going up into the grass a little bit. Again, making it quite random. It's a long way away. Now returning to the beach, there's a stream that goes through the middle. So I'm returning to yellow ochre and just putting in an area that's higher and slightly drier. And then getting the blue going round it. Just a slightly more warmer tone, just to separate it from the reflections on the darker side of the beach. And then the hut has now dried, so I can get some indigo and go down one side of the roof. The beach itself is just looking quite silvery here. So I'm going to get some French ultramarine, very weak. Just put it in, just to separate the tones. And a few streaks into the area of the stream. And that will separate it from the white surf that I'm just about to highlight. Now where the surf comes in, there's a dark line underneath, so I need some dark green mixed with the French ultramarine. I'm just going to, a medium brush, just put a little line in, and having got a line, I'll go back and drop a little bit more paint into it. And even though there's a lot of surf here, there's still a line where it meets the beach. Now there's about half a dozen people in this area here that I've drawn. I'm going to use Payne's Grey for them because it's a blustery day. They've all got coats on. Just because I haven't used Payne's Grey anywhere else. So I'm going to start with the shoulders, stop at the waist, do the legs, and then the head. And then just lose the bottom of the legs into the rock. And then I've got 3 people standing here. I'll just make a long mark. Put just a little emphasis. They're further away. And then they've got reflections, which is quite fun. There's somebody else here. And somebody nearly lost in the rocks. And then I've got somebody halfway up the beach. So we'll give them a friend. And this person here's got a rucksack or something, so I'm just going to make that a bit lighter. Now the navigation poles, you can only suggest them at this distance. The main thing about this one is the top. So put the top in, and it's not a complete pole, it's got lines on it, as has this one. Now the next thing I need to do is to make the water on top of the surf line a bit brighter so the white surf shows. So I'm just going in with the same colour but a bit stronger. There are some darker lines on this surf where it's rolling in. Now there's quite a difference in colour between the field and the hillside, so I'm just going back again, little brush, just making it a tiny bit brighter. just to show the field. Painting is constantly adjusting. Now I'm just going to get a bigger brush and lose the edge of that paint. And then the beach needs a tiny tickle, make it a bit brighter, just to give better visual impact. So this is just yellow ochre. And a little bit more dark through the reflections. So I've got number 4 brush on its side, and I'm just going to sweep it across just to pick up the tooth of the paper. Now I need to return to the hut, which is now completely dried, and I'm going to use some yellow ochre and some of the brown earlier just to warm it up a little bit. Let's put a little bit of paint on to give the rocks slightly more definition around the hut. And because the hut's quite pale, just makes it look more interesting. Now I've got the front of the roof and I've got one side, so I'm going to use a flat brush and a little bit of indigo to make a grey. Just do a straight line for the triangle and on the other side and just bring it down. So I'll rub out the pencil and then decide whether there's anything else that I need to add. I can see that the people that are reflected here have actually, because the angle of the light, got slightly wider reflection. I've just finished off by putting more emphasis on the balcony on the little summer house and a few bits of greenery going further down the cliff. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video and that you'll go for a weekend walk yourself soon. Thank you for watching.